Imagine a battlefield in 1945. The air is thick with the metallic scent of blood and the suffocating smoke of white phosphorus. Bullets are screaming past your ears like angry hornets. Every soldier around you is clutching a rifle, praying to any god that listens that they can pull the trigger faster than the enemy. But then, you see him. One man moving through the chaos without a gun. No pistol on his hip, no rifle on his shoulder, not even a knife in his boot. This is the hell of Okinawa, a place where men went to die, yet Desmond Doss walked into this inferno with nothing but a Bible and a medic kit. He was mocked as a coward, branded a traitor to his unit, and threatened with a court-martial. But before the sun would set on Hacksaw Ridge, this one man would perform a feat so legendary, so physically impossible, that it would change the history of warfare forever. This is the epic story of the greatest hero who never fired a single shot. To understand the man, we have to look back at the scars of his childhood. Desmond Doss was not born a pacifist. He was shaped by a moment of pure, raw terror. Growing up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, he was a spirited boy. But one day, a roughhouse fight with his brother turned nearly fatal. Desmond struck his brother with a heavy brick, and as he watched the blood pour from his sibling's head, something inside him broke. He looked at a framed poster of the 10 Commandments on their wall, specifically the image of Cain standing over Abel, and the words, "Thou shalt not kill," burned into his soul. His father, a veteran of the First World War, was a man haunted by the ghosts of his fallen friends, often turning to the bottle to drown the screams in his head. Desmond saw firsthand what violence did to a man's spirit. When World War II broke out, Desmond felt the call to serve his country, but his conscience forbade him from taking a life. He did not want to be a draft dodger. He wanted to be a medic. He called himself a conscientious cooperator. To him, the world was already full of people killing. He wanted to be the one individual dedicated to putting it back together. He joined the army with a simple but radical goal: to serve in the deadliest war in human history without ever touching a weapon. Little did he know, his greatest battle would not be against the enemy across the ocean, but against the very men he was sworn to save in the barracks. Military life is built on uniformity, but Desmond Doss was a glitch in the machine. From the moment he arrived at Fort Jackson, he was an outsider. While other recruits practiced bayonet drills and marksman skills, Desmond sat on his bunk reading his Bible. His fellow soldiers did not see a man of principle. They saw a liability. In their eyes, a soldier without a gun was a dead man who would get them killed too. The harassment was relentless. They threw boots at him while he prayed, called him a coward to his face, and even beat him in the dark of night, hoping he would break and quit. His commanders were no better. They tried to discharge him under Section 8, labeling him mentally unfit. They assigned him the most grueling, degrading tasks, trying to push him to his breaking point. But Desmond had a spine of steel hidden beneath his humble exterior. He refused to yield. Even when his captain threatened him with a court-martial for refusing to carry a rifle on Saturdays due to his religious beliefs, Desmond stood his ground. He told them clearly that he would go into combat, he would face the bullets, and he would do his duty, but he would not kill. Eventually, the army realized they could not break him. They let him stay, not because they respected him, but because they figured the front lines would take care of the problem for them. They expected him to be the first casualty when the boots hit the dirt in the Pacific. They had no idea they were looking at the toughest man in the division. In May 1945, the 77th Infantry Division arrived at the base of the Maeda Escarpment, a jagged, 400-foot cliff known as Hacksaw Ridge. It was a vertical wall of coral and rock that loomed over the island like a tombstone. The Japanese defenders had spent years turning this ridge into an impregnable fortress, honeycombed with hidden tunnels, caves, and machine gun nests. The Americans had to climb cargo nets just to reach the top, emerging into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. There was no cover, only the shattered remains of trees and the stench of death. As soon as the soldiers reached the summit, the world exploded. The Japanese launched a ferocious counterattack, popping out of the ground like ghosts and unleashing a wall of lead. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of mortars and heavy artillery that turned the ground into a meat grinder. Men were being torn apart in seconds. This was not a battle, it was an execution. Amidst this nightmare, Desmond Doss was everywhere. While others dived for cover, he was crawling toward the screams. He did not have a rifle to return fire, so he relied on speed, instinct, and a frantic prayer. He was dragging men through the mud, patching up arterial bleeds under direct fire, and shielding the wounded with his own body. The ridge was a chaotic maze of smoke and fire, and every time the Americans thought they had a foothold, the Japanese would push them back with suicidal intensity. The stage was set for a disaster that no one expected to survive. The breaking point came during a massive Japanese assault that forced a full-scale American retreat. The order was given: fall back to the edge and get down the cliff immediately. The sheer volume of fire was so intense that the US troops were literally blown off the top of the ridge. As the soldiers scrambled down the cargo nets in a desperate bid for survival, they left behind dozens of their brothers. These were men with shattered legs, chest wounds, and missing limbs, lying helpless in the dirt while the Japanese moved in to finish them off with bayonets. When the survivors gathered at the bottom of the cliff, they looked up and realized the horror of what had happened. There were nearly 100 men still up there, abandoned in the kill zone. But one man had not retreated. Desmond Doss stayed at the top, alone, unarmed, and surrounded by an enemy that took no prisoners. He chose to remain in the heart of the slaughter. The Japanese were crawling through the tunnels, hunting for survivors, while the Navy was shelling the ridge from the coast. It was a suicide mission, but Doss did not see the danger. He only heard the voices calling for help. He began to crawl through the darkness and the smoke, searching for any sign of life. Every time he found a man, he had to drag him through the jagged coral, sometimes for hundreds of yards, while staying low enough to avoid being spotted by snipers. He had no way to get them down the 400-foot drop safely, so he improvised. Using a rope he found, he tied a special double bowline knot, a skill he remembered from his youth, and began the agonizing process of lowering the wounded, one by one, down the sheer face of the cliff. Below, his comrades watched in disbelief as body after body descended from the clouds of smoke. It was as if a ghost was delivering the dead back to the living. For 12 grueling hours, Desmond Doss worked without rest. His hands were raw and bleeding from the rope. His lungs were burning from the smoke. Every muscle in his body was screaming for him to stop, to save himself, to run. But every time he lowered a man to safety, he looked back at the fire and prayed the same simple words: "Lord, please help me get just one more." He went back into the meat grinder again and again. He crawled into the very mouths of the caves where the Japanese were hiding, dragging out men who had been left for dead. At one point, he found a group of wounded soldiers pinned down by a sniper. Without hesitation, he stood up and diverted the enemy's attention, drawing fire toward himself so the wounded could crawl away. He was a target that refused to fall. There were moments when Japanese soldiers were within feet of him, yet for some reason, they did not see him or their guns jammed. It was as if a divine shield had been placed around him. By the time the sun began to rise, he had saved 75 men. 75 individuals who would have died alone in the mud were now safe because one man refused to carry a gun. Among those he saved were the very men who had beaten him in the barracks and called him a coward. He did not care about the past. He only cared about their lives. Eventually, Desmond himself was wounded. A grenade landed near him, and rather than let it kill his men, he tried to kick it away. The blast peppered his legs with shrapnel. Even then, as he was being carried away on a stretcher, he saw another man more seriously injured and crawled off the stretcher, insisting they take the other soldier instead. While waiting for help, he was shot in the arm by a sniper, fracturing his bone. He tied a rifle stock to his arm as a splint and crawled 300 yards to the aid station on his own. His physical body was broken, but his spirit was untouched. He had faced the absolute worst of humanity and responded with the absolute best. When the battle for Okinawa was finally over, the story of the medic who would not quit spread like wildfire through the army. The men who once mocked him now looked at him with a reverence usually reserved for saints. In October 1945, President Harry Truman stood before Desmond Doss and placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. He told Desmond, "I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military award. He never saw himself as a hero. He simply said he was doing God's work. He returned home to Virginia, living a humble life until he passed away in 2006. His story reminds us that true strength is not measured by the weapons we carry, but by the convictions we refuse to abandon. In a world of violence, he chose compassion. In a world of hate, he chose sacrifice. Desmond Doss did not need a gun to win a war. He only needed the courage to stand for what was right.